Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Marketers, media companies, and ad agencies took a stand against racism following George Floyd's murder, some with financial commitments and others with promises to make content and offices more diverse. But consumers are demanding more. Brands are uniquely positioned to address inequities and help shift the cultural tide. The question is, are they meeting expectations? Joining me now to discuss is Lola Bakare. She is a CMO advisor and inclusive marketing strategist. She worked on the front lines of marketing and as the director of brand marketing at the Daily Dot and the chief of staff and strategy innovation at Dell. She got her MBA from NYU School Stern of Business and her undergrad at UPenn. Lola, welcome to LinkedIn News Live.
Thank you, Caroline. It's wonderful to be here.
And joining us in this discussion is Kai D. Wright. For the past 10 years, Kai has been a scholar practitioner teaching graduate students at Columbia University. He is the author of the award-winning business book, Follow the Feeling, Brand Building in a Noisy World. He's also the founder and curator of Blacklist 100 and spent 5 years at the ad agency Ogilvy. He graduated from Columbia. Kai, welcome to the conversation.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I've been looking forward to this all week. This is a topic that we see a ton of conversation on LinkedIn, conversations that you two are leading in some cases. So I'm excited to speak with you both. Well, I'll take it over to you. Let's go back to the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. I'm sure you were tracking all of these companies coming out with these statements, but what did this commitment to diversity and inclusion look like specifically for the marketing world?
Well, I mean, it's so multifaceted, Caroline, and I think that's what makes it tough. In the marketing world, there are a couple dimensions of the issue. There's the workforce dimension. So do you have a workforce that represents or even over indexes on the 13% of the Black population in the United States? And the answer, the resounding response to that across brands and advertising agencies is no. So huge problem that leads to and contributes to the lack of diversity in campaigns, the lack of cultural sensitivity that campaigns have. And I think thirdly, the big opportunity, the sort of miss of thinking about how we do marketing in a way that might actually address some of the systemic problems that are super relevant to a brand or product or industry. So there are a couple companies really tapping into that, but I think it becomes complicated for brand leaders and advertising leaders to decide which prong of this should I focus on. The answer is you need to focus on all three. And the workforce problem is probably the one that is the most sort of burning, and we want to see answers. We want to see more movement.
And Kai, you've written several papers on the role that brands play in terms of advancing social justice. What is the role that brands play here in your mind? I think there are a lot of people, maybe some of them are joining us in the stream right now, who are thinking, it's just up to companies to make money, not necessarily do some of the things Lola was just outlining.
Yeah, well, there's been a big shift over the last couple of years in terms of what it means to be and operate from an equitable standpoint. Often when we think of equity, we start from a place of supply chain. We start from a place of procurement or vendors, and maybe think about sustainability. And that is where a lot of brands have started to make massive changes from an infrastructure standpoint. We're now going to have to apply all of that learning to marketing and communication and the way that we communicate. And it is possible. We see it as an imperative right now. What we have witnessed is a change in terms of the importance of digital, and then the importance of social media, then the importance of e-commerce. And last year when COVID-19 hit, we saw 10 weeks of growth that was equivalent to 10 years of growth in terms of e-commerce. And diversity and the world becoming more multicultural is that next major seismic shift that's going to impact businesses. And it's coming up slowly but surely, just in the way that digital, social, e-commerce, and so many other things like technology have done. And so it is, as Lola put it, the changing demographics that we have to pay attention to in the room, and doing the hard work of making sure that the representation of who is on screen, the representation of who's in the creative production processes also, and in the distribution process, once that creative product is made, is representative of the new world that we're entering into.
And Lola,
sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
Caroline, really quickly. It's representation, but the thing that people like Kai and myself are really championing is don't just stick people who you think we want to see in ads. It needs to be about authentic stories. Like my friend Gregory Page at Facebook released a campaign last week about the skateboarding culture on Instagram and like showing those individuals. We don't just want it to be what I call kind of like catalog representation. It needs to go deeper and really be authentic so that we're shifting the way consumers see the world. All consumers,
right?
Not targeting multicultural audiences.
And Lola, that's what I wanted to ask you about in particular, that hard work that Kai was just discussing, this imperative and this call to action. Some companies are just meeting it with kind of performative steps that they're taking. And your huge thing is to make sure that companies are doing truly inclusive marketing. So for those who are joining us in the stream, what is the difference between, say, slapping someone that you might want to see in an ad versus truly inclusive marketing?
I mean, I'm really interested to hear what Kai thinks about this. I've been really excited to have this chat with him as well. But the way I look at it is to maximize the movement, to take the highest advantage that you can of this moment that we're in. Your programs, your advertising, everything is with the goal of creating three things: a measurable revenue impact, because that's what creates commitment at the end of the day. And then most importantly, a measurable social impact. And I think that's the key place to focus on. If you do something that's performative, you're not actually going to create measurable results as far as more inclusion, more diversity, more equity. And then, of course, the third part is that negatively impacts the brand reputation. So if you look at that in terms of those three pillars, revenue, social impact, and reputation, and think about doing something that actually produces measurable results on all three of those, you get past the performative, past the proverbial black square, as we saw, so many folks suffered with sort of, defaulting to last summer.
Kai, anything to add there?
Absolutely. And Lola, just to pick up from that moment that we experienced at the Black Square, just to start with some macro context, and I want to give some very tangible ways, internally, externally, that we can start to do that hard work and continue doing that hard work. From macro context, McKinsey did analysis last year. They found that out of the largest 1,000 US companies, 30% of them made some type of public statement. Some of them in the form of a press release, some in the form of a roundup article that a journalist may have done, so it may have just been a quote, and some in the terms of social media post or advertising. And what we found is that in that 30% of commitments, 20% of them had very tangible, specific pledges. And so we now have a record to go back to from an accountability standpoint for certain organizations, but certainly we have a set of benchmarks that organizations that are new or just getting ready to take action and put infrastructure in place internally that they can look at publicly. And when we look at the agency landscape, there was a report done by Agency DE&I, and what they found is out of a survey of 300 agencies, 160 made public statements, right? So we have about a third of large companies, brands, clients, and then we have at least half of agencies that are trying to hold those parties accountable in terms of their actions that they're taking. Now, what do we have to do, right? Because there's a lot of ways for that representation to show up in creative or behind the scenes. And so when I think about Lola and her mission on maximizing the movement, right, the internal things that really companies can start doing is fourfold. They can start looking at their practices, deconstructing them, right? How do people greet each other when they walk in a room? It's very simple. Their processes, how are they assigning different projects to different individuals? How are performance reviews happening? Are they written to certain standards that maybe need to be changed? And then policies, that third of the fourth area, right? What are the rules? Who gets to represent the organization and go out and be the face of it? That's shaping business and the context of how partners are being brought in. And then lastly, programs. And we have a lot of programs internally, like diversity programs, that try to give empathy to a new audience, but they don't work because they don't change. And so there's been a lot of research done by Adam Grant and Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania. Anyone who's read Grit or Outliers or any of their books know that they focus on organizational design. And what they say is you really have to change programs internally to be responsive to the results that you're getting. And often an organization will just keep doing the same thing.
And Kai, those numbers that you just shared, both the third and the half, they seem low to me. No, I mean, what is the other 2/3 doing, and what is the other half doing? And in all honesty, what's going to happen to their businesses if they're not thinking about these issues right now?
Well, I'm sure Lola has a lot to say. The quick thing that I'll say about it is there will always be leaders and laggards. And so it becomes a personal philosophical stance that someone has to take from a leadership standpoint to say, are we going to operate with the leader mentality, or are we going to operate from a laggard mentality? And there are consequences to being a laggard. And I think right now there's a lot of grace to companies that are attempting to be leaders.
Yes. I knew I was going to love hearing from Kai in this conversation. It is, think about it when we go back to, the publishing industry and the rise of the internet. And who were the folks, I'm not going to name names, but who decided they were going to get in front of it and innovate? And who were the folks who decided they were going to put their heads down and hope that it would go away and that they could still market news in the same way? And we see how that turned out, and we see it over and over and over again. Just look back to, we've had marketing thought leaders telling us this story forever. Theodore Levitt in the 1950s and 60s with his marketing myopia, the premise of know what industry you're in and know what people really want, and don't be static, right? Like, don't be myopic about this. It is the people who are taking action now, and we've talked about a bunch of really interesting examples that are going to benefit from making sure people understand the future is multicultural and it can no longer be in a silo.
I love thinking about this monumental shift in marketing that we're seeing right now being akin to the adoption of the internet for these agencies. I think that a lot of companies would value thinking about it that in that big way. Before we continue this conversation, I want to say hello to some of the members who are joining us in the stream. We have Shannon from Sacramento, Judith from Atlanta, Mary from Wisconsin, and Becky from Houston. Thanks for joining us here on LinkedIn News Live. And if you are just joining us, we're having a conversation about inclusive marketing with some gurus, experts. They know it all. So if you have questions for us, let us know in the stream and we'll get those answered on today's show. All right, this movement, if you will, a lot of it is being driven by consumers and their expectations. I want to take a look at some results from a recent trust barometer that Edelman put out recently that said basically that consumers are expecting much more from brands. They want brands not just to drive profit, sell them something, but they also want brands to be their protector, to solve their problems that they're facing in society. And they also want brands to take a stab at societal problems. And these are some of the biggest numbers that Edelman has ever put out. Kai, I'll start with you. How is this happening? That consumers are now looking to companies to really respond to what's happening in society and have that be reflected in their messaging?
Yeah, well, this shift, is not brand new. It started, I think, when we think of the broader landscape of diversity and equity, we can probably map it back to, examples of the LGBTQ movement. In terms of fighting for rights, there were a number of organizations that joined in terms of marriage equality and really framing and amplifying and giving media representation to that population. And so brands are accustomed to getting involved in social justice when it comes to pay equity and women's rights and women's equality. Brands have been very vocal and involved in that for years also. If you think of the brands that were behind the scenes and out front in terms of the Me Too movement. And so this is another demonstration, another opportunity for brands to continue to show that they understand the reality in which their consumers live. And that's really what it's about. It's about recognizing the reality and whose reality is the one that is playing out. To give context, in 1960, 85% of the US, and this is according to the Census Bureau, was white. In 2010, almost 60% was white. By 2030 to 2040, we will have a minority US country. And so it really is about recognizing the reality that demographics are shifting, communities of consumers are shifting, and the employee base is not only shifting from a generational standpoint, right? But it's shifting from a standpoint of what it values and what it wants to prioritize.
Lola, I see you shaking your head, and I know you feel strongly about this as well. But I want to get your take. But before I do, I want to go back to the Edelman survey and look specifically at how consumers are thinking about racial equity and if brands should represent racial equity. Kai was just saying that this isn't a big shift that's been happening over time, but Edelman did see a big swing in these numbers in terms of people who agree that equity statements need action or will be seen as opportunistic by brands. These are bigger numbers than they've ever seen. In terms of racial equity, talk to us a little bit about the changing demographics that Kai was just talking about, but also what consumers are expecting from brands on this topic.
Well, and I want to also contextualize as I answer that the reason for the shift. And, we're going to see in the comments, because it always happens, people sort of poo-pooing the why now. But the reality is there was something very important that happened when George Floyd was murdered. And that was that we all saw it. And what we're seeing is in these Edelman numbers that changed the way we look at what should be happening, because it was impossible to ignore, even though those sorts of brutal murders had been happening for years. And so when we think about the opportunity for advertisers and marketers, the workforce piece is hugely important. But even in terms of what are the ad dollars, the billions that get spent every quarter actually investing in, we need those investments to actually address these systemic problems. And that is something that is not going to change. Those that get in front of it are going to see huge benefits. We're seeing with Citi, their Action for Racial Equity campaign. This is my favorite example. It's at the top of the funnel, but it's actually making banking more accessible to the Black community. That's a systemic problem that the marketing approach is investing in. So that's what we're really talking about when we talk about getting beyond the performative.
And Kai, I want to get back to something that we were talking about earlier in this discussion about what these ad agencies look like, what the people in-house that are making these decisions at these marketing firms look like. We saw in Ad Age, I know that you saw that article in Ad Age showing that the numbers are moving in the right direction. These companies are hiring more and more diverse talent, but it's moving slowly. And most of the people at these decision-making tables are white men. Are they stepping up now? Do you really feel like they get it? Or is this something that even internally there's been resistance to get to the same page of where we all are in this conversation right now?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Caroline. I'll frame this by saying that I'm a member of Ad Age's U.S. Diversity Council, which they created last year out of the wake of a need for change within the industry. And so I think there is recognition that there are different stories to tell. There's different vantage points. There's different questions to ask to hold individuals accountable on the creative and executive level, other than just recognizing great creative work. And so I'm really happy of the continual pressure that organizations like them have been putting on the industry also. When it comes to change internally, there's always going to be some level of anticipated resistance because we're asking individuals to trust a group of leaders that they have no idea what they're going to do. So we have our human nature that is fighting against us that we can anticipate will fight against us in terms of change. Because as you put it, Caroline, there is a traditional persona of the type of person that can lead a client relationship, that can lead a media entity, and that can command an army of thousands of individuals all around the world. And so we have to break the psyche that minorities or people of color are unpredictable in their results. McKinsey has already quantified that organizations led by minorities, people of color, outperform. They've done this research 4 times since 2010, looking at the largest US companies, and what they found is by double digits, companies that lead from a place of diversity outperform. And so there are some specific things that we have to do, right? I think Lola definitely has her probably wish list of things for the industry. Mine would be this: no more pledges. We've seen all the pledges that we need to see. It's time to shift language from future tense of what you will do to present tense of what you are doing. It's time to prioritize solving the problems that people are asking to be solved. All of these agencies and client organizations have employee resource groups, business resource groups. They've done the research. They've listened for years what employees want, what the engagement of within the company of different offices are. Just solve and prioritize the problems that they're asking for and the problems that consumers are asking for, and stick to those. And then behavior change happens on two different levels. It happens from a standpoint of incentives, and it happens from a standpoint of penalties. And right now we are expecting behavior change to happen through benevolence and empathy, which has not been demonstrated in the past. When I got in that industry in 2006, there was an agreement between the New York Commission of Human Rights and the 16 largest ad agencies that they had to diversify 15 years ago. And that's what led me into the industry. And so now being able to see this level from a partner standpoint, what I can say is we are not an industry that is going to change the benevolence of people. We need to try penalty incentives. That means getting eliminated from RFPs if you don't meet certain incentives. That means minimum spends, and being able to pull back work in that case. And this is how we're taught as children, right? We're taught about incentives and penalties. Incentives, you get good grades, you get ice cream, right? Or you get to take a trip to someplace, or you go see a movie. Penalties, you don't pay your taxes, guess what? You're going to pay fees. You may go to jail.
Exactly.
So
yeah. And
these are two organizational design principles that leaders are afraid to put into place. And the only
sorry to cut you off there, Kai, but why are they scared to put them in place? Is it, Lola, do you think it's a fear of just the fact that they won't be able to meet these goals and then they'll look bad? Reputational risk. And does that reputational risk outweigh them doing nothing?
It's about prioritization, Caroline. And the thing is, when you decide you're going to mobilize your workforce to work from home in 5 days, because that's what's happening now, it gets done. And, the moment that, and we're getting there, these organizations see that what Kai is saying, the need to set up these incentives that are public and transparent, and these penalties that are public and transparent, the moment that more and more of them see that this is not going away, it's going to happen. And I think that happens from activists within the industry really being noisy. We see people like Cindy Gallup doing it for the Me Too movement. I think in advertising, Walt Geer is a person I've been watching who's really holding people's feet to the fire. He told Gary Vaynerchuk, you said you were going to have 3 Black executives. Where are they? And he interviewed him live, and then he interviewed him live again, and now they're there. So it's going to take us being willing to rock the boat, to be a little whistleblowy, and get people to understand that this is just really not going away. And we all have the power to do that.
Well, I love a good ad. I love to hate a bad ad. I'm sure you two feel the same way as you. I'm sure the people who are joining us in the stream right now. I thought it'd be fun. I thought it'd be fun to take a look at a few that have worked recently. And I know, Lola, you've been tracking these. I took them from your website. You're calling these some of the brands that are making max moves, as you were talking about at the beginning of this discussion. Let's first talk about Peloton's recent ad campaign. For the first time without actors, Peloton released this, which is their We All Have Our Reasons campaign, which highlighted real riders from all walks of life. The brand was using kind of authentic stories, paving the way that it's been able to skyrocket growth during this pandemic, quite frankly. Lola, why did this one really work for you and for the brand itself, particularly after their disastrous ad that they had? Well, it feels like 2 Christmases ago, but with the pandemic, my timing's all off. So it could have been 5 Christmases ago. But with the woman, and she got the Peloton. Why is this one better?
Well, the first thing we're going to say is, Kai made this point. Who is it that leads Peloton again? From a marketing standpoint, it's a Black woman named Dara Tressiter. And she came in with her insight and her perspective, and she led with emotional connection. Marcus Collins, someone else I love who works at Uber, has said it's about going from insight to intimacy. And to me, that's exactly what that ad does. It is, you are there on the ground with the people who have this aspiration to be healthier, and you are showing them in the creative. I mean, it is the slam dunk example of what we really mean by representation. It's not catalog, it's real. These are the people. Kai, I'm curious what you think about it.
Well, I have a lot of fun with students. I've been a scholar practitioner for going into 10 years. And so I've had hundreds of students over the years, and I get to analyze a lot of communication. And I generally have a framework of 5 things I look for in a creative standpoint. And I really encourage, as a lot of creative leaders and business leaders set a new direction, that they create something written down that comes a checklist for them that says, did we think of this? Did we do that? And so to pick up from Lola's point, Peloton is one of those organizations that for the past couple of years I've tracked, and Follow the Feeling. It's one of the prime examples that she used out of 1,500 fast growing companies that was analyzed. And Peloton specifically really hits on a lot of community triggers, and companies that are going to grow and outpace their competitors are going to do so because their community that's around them is going to feel as if the organization's investing in them and hears them, sees them, and is empowering them. And so, Peloton, pretty similar to other organizations like Weight Watchers, they take the vantage point, or recently have taken the vantage point of many users, and really emphasizing the community aspect rather than just the benefit that you're going to get intrinsically, right? So Caroline, if you go back and think about the ad from 2 years ago that featured just the woman, that's a very individual motivation. Whereas in this new wave of advertising, it's really about community and other individuals and creating new rituals with those people who you have some type of shared belief or experience with.
And a lot of brands, they're in this place right now where they almost have to take these risks to meet these consumer expectations when it comes to their advertising. But of course, there have been brands who have been bold long before the summer of 2020. I want to show this billboard up from Ben & Jerry's, who was a longtime supporter of Colin Kaepernick before it was in vogue to support Colin Kaepernick and his mission. This is a billboard that was outside of Raymond James Stadium prior to the Super Bowl on February 6th in 2021 in Tampa, Florida. Ben & Jerry's is a classic example of just a company who's been doing this right for so long. Lola, what can we learn from them?
Here's what we learned from Ben & Jerry's. I'm so glad you brought them up as a company. When you take a stand, it counts to people. And when you try to be, Kai is a marketing professor, he knows this better than anybody. When you try to be all things to all people, you're never going to have raving fans. Another one of my mentors, Christo, says, make fans gain enemies. That is the goal. It is okay to be on the side that aligns with your brand of a polarized issue, because you're going to have that much more devotion from the people who agree with you. And what you showed us from the Edelman Trust Barometer study, Caroline, is so important. It's what should persuade brands that are on the fence of taking a side in any social justice issues that, if you want to be on the side of making money, you need to be on the side of progress towards a more equitable world. That's literally where we're going. And either you want to get on the bus or you want to put your head in the sand and your business will become obsolete.
Anything to add there from the classroom, Kai?
I'll just add, before I reference that organizations that think about a framework. So I'll give you the one that I use. It's 5 parts. And I think you see it demonstrated in Peloton. You see it demonstrated in Ben & Jerry's, what both of those organizations do incredibly well. The first thing is they get right lexicon, right? So are they speaking from the voice of individuals in the community? Are they not using jargon? Are they plain spoken? Or better yet, audio? Who is speaking, right? Is it an abstract voiceover, or is it someone that has some meaningfulness to the community that's going to create empathy? The visuals are very striking, and they stand out in terms of the vantage point. Both are about rituals, right? We think about experience. Ben & Jerry's, just like after a natural disaster, and some organizations want to be known as the reputation of the first ones, the first responders who are there on the ground. Ben & Jerry's as a brand has really earned that reputation as being the first on the ground when it comes to something that's breaking in terms of social justice. And that comes through a ritual of training individuals to shop at certain times and around certain issues when news is spiking. And then lastly is culture. And both organizations do a really great job with culture, right? They are
the leaders, not laggers, right, Kai? As you told us at the beginning of the show. I'm learning from you.
They have risked it, to become leaders, right? But it's rare that someone's going to start off as a leader. I think a brand would have to be very arrogant to say, I'm going to do this thing and I'm going to be a leader from the beginning. I think that's part of what is earned in terms of the trust and the authenticity. Those are two things that leaders are going to demonstrate, and that takes time, right? That takes going from making all those pledges and making a bunch of noise and PR to actually walking the walk and having a team, as Lola mentioned, that internally is reflective and bringing different vantage points that can be manifest externally in creative work.
And thankfully, a lot more companies are taking that time. Yeah, Lola, very quickly, I've learned so much. I've seen a lot of people in the stream thanking you guys for spending this time with us. Lola, before I let you both go, Kai shared his wish list of things that he wants to change now. No more pledges. Let's start talking about what we're doing now. I want to hear your wish list before we go.
Perfect segue to what I wanted to just add here. My first on my wish list is that companies start to go to cutting edge experts on the front lines of all the dimensions of these issues. So two people I'll name that I think are really important thought leaders right now. John Graham wrote the book Plantation Theory. This is about how do you really step outside of yourself as a non-Black person leading an organization and really understand the lived experience of Black people in corporate and think about the historical context of that. I recommend everybody check that out and look into his work. Then there are people like my friend Monique Arrington who are changing the way we recruit. What would it look like for you not to even know the name of an individual throughout the interview and hiring process so that you're eliminating that bias? She systematized it. So I think really tapping into the people who are innovating across all of the swim lanes of these issues is one. The second thing is don't do the whataboutism thing. I think one of the things that slows us down in this conversation is people saying, well, what about this other thing we could be doing? Well, what about this other thing that's really important? And then what do we have? We have inaction. Understand that if you're going to be a leader, you can do multiple things at once. Every CEO, CMO, marketing director, agency leader does it. And we have that exact same expectation when it comes to creating more equity within the marketing and advertising space. And then lastly, it is that we all recognize the opportunity that just purely thinking about creative and programs, as Kyle was saying, has to change the way we see the world. So I'll end with one of my favorite examples from years ago. There's a Coca-Cola ad where a white little boy and a Black little boy are touching knees in the creative, sharing a Coke. That was the first time that physical interaction had happened. And what does it do? It gives permission. And so something that simple can literally change what our norms are. And that's exactly what we need. And we want to see way more of it.
Really powerful example to end on there. Lola, Kai, thank you so much for this conversation. The stream is just loving it and learning so much as well. Just thank you so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And it's people like you who are doing the writing about this week in, week out, and really bringing thought leaders together that make a difference. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Lola. That's very nice. Thank you. All right. That was Lola Bakare as well as Kai D. Wright talking to us about inclusive marketing and how we can advance this conversation both on and off LinkedIn. Speaking of LinkedIn, this conversation is just popping. So if you want to check out this conversation as well as more top conversations about the professional world, you can check it out in the news module. All right. On Monday, my colleague Nina Melendez will be discussing what the most transformative thing you can do for your mind to help you focus and boost your memory and even make you smarter. I'll definitely be tuning in. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks for watching LinkedIn News Live.